June 6, 1944, and the gray dawn over Omaha Beach carried more than the thunder of naval bombardment. Beneath the chaos of dying men and screaming shells, a distinct metallic ping echoed across the bloodied sand, a sound that would become the harbinger of doom for German soldiers throughout the European theater. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann pressed his face against the cold concrete of his bunker observation slit, watching American soldiers advance with weapons that spoke death 8 times before falling silent. Unlike his own Karabiner 98 Kurz, which required manual cycling after each shot, these American rifles fired as rapidly as the soldiers could pull their triggers. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The M1 Garand represented a technological leap that military strategists had long predicted would change infantry warfare forever. While European armies clung to bolt-action rifles inherited from the Great War, American General John Cantius Garand had spent 15 years perfecting a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle that would transform the United States Army into the most powerfully armed infantry force in human history. According to military historian John McManus, writing in his comprehensive study of American infantry tactics, the Garand gave American riflemen a rate of fire advantage of 3-to-1 over their German counterparts in typical combat situations. This disparity became even more pronounced in close-quarters combat, where the ability to deliver rapid, aimed fire meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Zimmermann had heard whispers about these rifles from veterans of the Italian campaign, men who returned with haunted eyes and spoke of American soldiers who could fire entire clips before a German rifleman could work his bolt twice. Command had dismissed these reports as exaggeration, the expected complaints of soldiers seeking to justify defeats. But now, crouched in his defensive position as American infantry methodically cleared the beach obstacles, Zimmermann understood that those veterans had understated the terror. Each American infantryman carried not just superior firepower but the confidence that came with it. They advanced aggressively, knowing their weapons gave them overwhelming tactical advantage at the ranges where most infantry combat occurred. The technical specifications seemed modest on paper. The Garand weighed 9.5 pounds, fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge from an 8-round en-bloc clip, and measured 43.6 inches in length. But these numbers failed to capture the weapon's true revolutionary nature. Unlike semi-automatic rifles attempted by other nations, which proved temperamental and unreliable, the Garand functioned flawlessly in the mud of Normandy, the snow of the Ardennes, and the dust of North Africa. Its reliability became legendary among American troops, who learned they could depend on their rifles when everything else failed. German military doctrine, refined through decades of Prussian military tradition, emphasized disciplined volley fire and the ability of trained soldiers to maintain sustained fire rates with bolt-action rifles. This doctrine had proven devastatingly effective in previous conflicts. But doctrine written for the battlefields of 1914 proved inadequate against an enemy whose basic infantry weapon fundamentally altered the tactical calculus of small unit engagements. The Americans had not simply equipped their soldiers with better rifles. They had created a new form of infantry warfare built around overwhelming firepower at the squad level. January 8, 1928, and John Cantius Garand stood in the dim workshop of Springfield Armory, examining the prototype that had consumed his life for the previous 6 years. Born in Quebec, Canada, on New Year's Day 1888, Garand had emigrated to the United States as a young man, bringing with him an engineer's mind and an immigrant's determination to prove himself. His hands, stained with gun oil and metal filings, adjusted the gas port on his semi-automatic rifle design for the 1,000th time. The United States Army had requested a self-loading rifle, but the technical challenges had defeated every designer who attempted the task. The problem was deceptively simple yet maddeningly complex. A semi-automatic rifle must harness the explosive force of firing to cycle the action, extract the spent cartridge, load a fresh round, and reset the firing mechanism, all while maintaining accuracy and reliability. Previous attempts had produced rifles that worked under ideal conditions but failed spectacularly when exposed to dirt, moisture, or temperature extremes. The French had fielded the Fusil automatique model 1917, but it proved so unreliable that French soldiers often disabled the automatic function and used them as manual rifles. The Mexican Mondragon rifle showed promise but could not withstand battlefield conditions. Garand approached the challenge with methodical precision. He tested dozens of operating systems, experimenting with blowback, recoil operation, and various gas-operated mechanisms. His breakthrough came with a rotating bolt design coupled with a gas-operated piston that tapped propellant gases from the barrel to cycle the action. The system was elegant in its simplicity, using the rifle's own firing force to prepare it for the next shot. But simplicity in concept required extraordinary complexity in execution. Each component needed precise tolerances, heat treatment, and metallurgy to withstand the violent forces generated by firing thousands of rounds. The Springfield Armory testing grounds became Garand's second home. He fired prototype after prototype, sometimes destroying a rifle that had taken months to build simply to understand why it failed. According to Bruce Canfield's Comprehensive History of American Military Firearms, a collector's guide to United States combat weapons, Garand personally test-fired over 200,000 rounds during the rifle's development, his shoulder bearing the bruises of countless recoil impacts. He refined the clip-loading system, settling on an 8-round end-block clip that inserted into the rifle from above. Critics argued for a detachable box magazine like those used on submachine guns, but Garand insisted his system provided better reliability and protected the ammunition from dirt. The Army trials of 1929 pitted Garand's design against competitors from established firearms manufacturers. His rifle, designated test rifle T1E2, competed against designs from John Pedersen, a legendary firearms designer whose toggle-delayed blowback rifle was considered the favorite. The trials were exhaustive, subjecting each rifle to endurance tests, accuracy evaluations, and torture tests designed to simulate battlefield abuse. Garand's rifle fired 6,000 rounds with only minor malfunctions. Pedersen's rifle, despite its sophisticated design, suffered repeated failures. The Army's Ordnance Department, traditionally conservative and skeptical of innovation, found itself forced to acknowledge that a self-taught immigrant engineer had solved a problem that had stumped the greatest firearms designers in the world. General Douglas MacArthur, serving as Army Chief of Staff, personally reviewed the test results. On January 9, 1936, the United States Army officially adopted Garand's rifle as the United States Rifle, caliber .30 M1. It was the first semi-automatic rifle adopted as a standard service weapon by any nation's military. Garand received no royalties for his invention, having developed it as a government employee. He would earn less than $100 in bonuses for creating the weapon that would help win the Second World War, December 7, 1941, and the surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor transformed American industry overnight. The Springfield Armory, which had been producing Garand rifles at a modest rate, suddenly faced demands that seemed impossible to meet. The United States Army, expanding from a peacetime force of fewer than 200,000 to millions of soldiers, needed weapons immediately. Winchester Repeating Arms Company and Harrington and Richardson joined production, but even their combined efforts could not keep pace with demand. Early units deploying to combat in 1942 carried a mix of Garand rifles and outdated Springfield 1903 bolt-action rifles. The 1st Marine Division landing at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942 became the first major American formation to test the Garand under sustained combat conditions. Private First Class Robert Leckie, whose memoir, Helmet for My Pillow, would later document his experiences, carried a Garand ashore with the 1st Marine Regiment. The oppressive heat and humidity of the Solomon Islands created conditions far worse than any proving ground test. Rust formed overnight on exposed metal. The fine volcanic sand infiltrated every crevice. Marines learned to wrap their rifles in whatever material they could find to protect the actions from the elements. Japanese infantry tactics, emphasizing night infiltration and close-quarters combat, should have negated the Garand's firepower advantages. But American Marines discovered that the rifle's rapid fire proved even more valuable in the chaotic darkness of jungle fighting. When Japanese soldiers launched their terrifying banzai charges, screaming warriors rushing American positions in waves, Marines could deliver devastating volumes of fire without the desperate vulnerability of working bolt actions in the dark. The distinctive 8-round capacity meant Marines could engage multiple targets without reloading, a crucial advantage when facing human wave attacks. The Garand's weaknesses revealed themselves alongside its strengths. The en-bloc clip system, while reliable, required soldiers to fire all 8 rounds before reloading. A Marine who fired 3 rounds at a target could not top off his rifle with additional ammunition, potentially leaving himself with a partially loaded weapon at a critical moment. The distinctive ping of the ejecting clip, praised by some as a satisfying sound, warned nearby enemies that an American soldier was reloading. German and Japanese soldiers learned to listen for that sound, timing their attacks for the moment when their opponent's rifle was empty. Maintenance proved more demanding than with simple bolt-action rifles. The Garand's gas system required regular cleaning to prevent carbon buildup from blocking the gas port. In the field, without proper cleaning supplies, Marines improvised solutions. They learned to field strip their rifles in darkness, identifying parts by touch. They discovered that the rifle could function with remarkable abuse, but only if basic maintenance was performed. A Garand neglected for days in jungle humidity could seize up, its action frozen by corrosion and debris. These lessons, learned through painful experience on Guadalcanal, were documented and incorporated into training programs for later units. Despite these challenges, the rifle earned fierce loyalty from those who carried it. General George Patton, never one for understatement, declared the Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. His assessment, while hyperbolic, reflected the genuine appreciation. American soldiers felt for a weapon that gave them superiority over enemies who often possessed greater tactical experience. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the Garand had proven itself in the crucible of combat, and production priorities ensured that subsequent American units would be fully equipped with the rifle that was already changing infantry warfare. October 15, 1943, and Hauptmann Friedrich Weber stood in the shattered remains of a German defensive position outside Salerno, Italy, examining the bodies of his soldiers and trying to understand what had gone wrong. Weber commanded a company of veteran infantrymen, survivors of campaigns in France, Russia, and North Africa. These were not inexperienced conscripts, but hardened soldiers who understood infantry combat at an instinctive level. Yet they had been overwhelmed by American troops who, according to captured intelligence reports, possessed inferior tactical training and limited combat experience. The answer lay in the rifles scattered among the dead Americans. Weber picked up a Garand, noting its weight and balance. He worked the action, impressed by its smoothness despite obvious hard use. German weapons procurement officers had obtained sample Garands for evaluation earlier in the war, and their reports acknowledged the rifle's technical sophistication. But those sterile evaluations failed to capture the psychological impact of facing opponents whose basic infantry weapons allowed them to dominate firefights. Weber had commanded men armed with the Karabiner 98 Kurs since 1939. It was a superb bolt-action rifle, accurate and reliable, descended from a design that had served German armies since 1898. But it was fundamentally a weapon of the previous war. The tactical implications went far beyond simple rates of fire. German infantry doctrine, developed through exhaustive study of combat experience, emphasized the squad automatic weapon as the source of firepower. Each infantry squad centered around its Maschinengewehr 42 machine gun, with riflemen serving primarily to protect the machine gun crew and suppress enemy infantry. This doctrine assumed that enemy riflemen posed minimal threat to a well-positioned machine gun team. The Garand shattered that assumption. American riflemen could deliver suppressive fire comparable to light automatic weapons, allowing them to pin German machine gun positions, while other elements maneuvered for flanking attacks. According to captured German after-action reports, now preserved in the United States National Archives, Wehrmacht officers repeatedly noted the aggressive tactics employed by American infantry. These reports, compiled by military historian Peter Mansour in his work, The GI offensive in Europe revealed German surprise at the willingness of American soldiers to assault defended positions. German officers attributed this aggressiveness partly to American tactical doctrine but largely to the confidence inspired by superior weapons. A soldier armed with a Garand could advance while delivering aimed fire, something impossible with a bolt-action rifle that required stopping to work the bolt after each shot. The German response came in two forms, one immediate and one long-term. Immediately, German infantry adapted their tactics to counter the American firepower advantage. They increased emphasis on camouflage and concealment, knowing they needed to achieve surprise to offset their disadvantage in sustained firefights. They concentrated machine guns and employed them more aggressively, attempting to use superior crew-served weapons to compensate for inferior individual arms. They studied the Garand's weaknesses, training soldiers to exploit the weapon's 8-round capacity and the brief vulnerability when American soldiers reloaded. The long-term response involved Germany's desperate attempt to field semi-automatic rifles of their own. The Gehör 41 and later the Gehör 43 represented Germany's recognition that bolt-action rifles had become obsolete. But these rifles entered service too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. German industrial capacity, strained by Allied bombing and resource shortages, could not produce semi-automatic rifles in sufficient quantities while simultaneously manufacturing tanks, aircraft, and artillery. By the time Germany fielded semi-automatic rifles, American production had equipped millions of soldiers with Garands, and the technological gap had become insurmountable. Weber survived the Italian campaign and later fought in Normandy, where he experienced firsthand the horror of facing American infantry armed with Garands in the hedgerows of France. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote that the sound of multiple Garands firing simultaneously produced a distinct rolling thunder that German soldiers learned to fear. It meant American infantry had engaged and would advance aggressively, confident in their firepower superiority. For German soldiers conditioned to expect tactical advantage over their opponents, the psychological reversal was devastating. November 20th, 1943, and the 2nd Marine Division waded ashore at Tarawa Atoll, beginning one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps' history. The Coral Atoll, fortified by Japanese forces into a seemingly impregnable fortress, would test the Garand under conditions that pushed both weapon and warriors to their absolute limits. Staff Sergeant William Bordelon, armed with his Garand, moved through chest-deep water under withering fire from Japanese positions. The rifle, supposedly vulnerable to water immersion, would prove its worth in the most hostile environment imaginable. The Japanese defensive philosophy on Pacific Islands created unique tactical challenges. Unlike European warfare, where combat occurred across varied terrain with opportunities for maneuver, island fighting compressed battles into small spaces where every yard was contested with fanatical determination. Japanese bunkers, constructed from logs, coral, and concrete, withstood naval bombardment that should have obliterated them. American Marines, advancing across open ground against these fortifications, needed every advantage their weapons could provide. The Garand delivered firepower that made impossible assaults barely possible. Marine tactics evolved to maximize the Garand's strengths in this brutal environment. Fire teams learned to advance by bounds, with some Marines providing covering fire while others moved forward. The Garand's semi-automatic fire allowed single Marines to pin Japanese positions, delivering rapid, aimed shots that forced defenders to keep their heads down. This covering fire proved far more effective than the scattered fire possible with bolt-action rifles. Marines could maintain sustained fire while changing positions, something that required multiple riflemen with bolt-action weapons. The coral and sand of Pacific atolls presented maintenance challenges different from jungle environments but equally demanding. Coral dust, finer than desert sand, infiltrated actions and could cause malfunctions if not addressed immediately. Saltwater corrosion attacked metal surfaces with aggressive persistence. Marines learned to disassemble and clean their rifles during brief lulls in combat, knowing their lives depended on weapon reliability. The Garand's relatively simple design, despite being more complex than bolt-action rifles, proved maintainable even under these extreme conditions. Marines developed almost superstitious attachment to their individual rifles, maintaining them with obsessive care. Japanese soldiers, facing American firepower superiority, adapted their own tactics in response. They emphasized night infiltration, knowing darkness negated some of the Garand's advantages. They developed specialized sniper tactics, with individual marksmen armed with precision rifles attempting to eliminate American soldiers before they could bring their automatic fire to bear. They constructed interlocking fields of fire that channeled American attacks into killing zones where even superior weapons could not compensate for tactical disadvantage. Yet despite these adaptations, Japanese after-action reports consistently noted the devastating effect of American small arms fire. The battle for Tarawa lasted 76 hours and cost the lives of over 1,000 Marines. Japanese defenders, numbering approximately 4,700, fought virtually to the last man with only 17 soldiers surrendering. In the aftermath, Marine commanders analyzed the battle's lessons, and the Garand featured prominently in their assessments. According to military historian Joseph Alexander, writing in Storm Landings, Epic Amphibious Battles in the Central Pacific, Marine officers credited the Garand with providing the firepower advantage that made victory possible, albeit at terrible cost. They noted that Marines armed with bolt-action rifles would have suffered even higher casualties attempting the same assaults. The Marine Corps became the Garand's most vocal advocates. Unlike Army infantry, who might fight in various theaters against diverse enemies, Marines focused almost exclusively on Pacific Island warfare against Japanese forces. In this specific context, the Garand's advantages proved even more decisive. Marine training incorporated the rifle's capabilities into every aspect of small unit tactics. By 1944, the Marine Corps had developed a tactical system built around the Garand's firepower, creating an infantry force optimized for the brutal combat of island warfare. Japanese soldiers learned to fear not just American material superiority, but the individual Marine rifleman whose weapon made him the equal of 3 enemy soldiers. December 16, 1944, and German artillery crashed into American positions throughout the Ardennes forest, beginning Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to split Allied forces and reach Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, would test American soldiers and their weapons under the most brutal conditions of the European War. Private First Class Francis Curry, fighting with the 30th Infantry Division, discovered that his Garand's reliability would mean the difference between survival and death in the frozen forests of Belgium. The Ardennes offensive caught American forces by surprise, with German panzer divisions breaking through thinly held defensive lines. American infantry suddenly found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply lines, and fighting desperately against veteran German troops who should have learned by now that assaulting American infantry positions invited destruction. Yet the combination of surprise, overwhelming force, and winter conditions that grounded Allied aircraft created tactical situations where German advantages in armor and artillery offset American firepower superiority. The Garand would prove its worth not through dramatic victories, but through the quiet reliability that kept soldiers alive during desperate defensive stands. Winter warfare presented unique challenges for all weapons, but semi-automatic rifles proved particularly vulnerable to cold weather malfunctions. The Garand's gas-operated system relied on precise tolerances that thermal contraction could disrupt. Lubricants thickened in sub-zero temperatures, potentially slowing the action or causing failures to feed. American ordnance officers had anticipated these problems, developing special cold weather lubricants and issuing instructions for cold weather maintenance. But theory encountered reality in the frozen foxholes of Belgium, where soldiers fought in temperatures that dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. American soldiers discovered that the Garand functioned remarkably well in extreme cold, provided basic precautions were observed. The key was reducing lubrication to absolute minimum levels, as excess oil would congeal and gum up the action. Soldiers learned to wipe their rifles nearly dry, leaving only the thinnest film of lubricant on critical surfaces. They kept their rifles inside their coats when possible, using body heat to prevent ice formation. They learned to cycle the action periodically to prevent snow from freezing in the mechanism. These field-expedient techniques, shared among soldiers and incorporated into unit procedures, kept Garands functioning when German Mauser rifles, simpler and theoretically more reliable, were also struggling with the cold. The desperate combat in the Ardennes proved the psychological value of the Garand as much as its technical superiority. American units, surrounded and outnumbered, held positions that should have been overrun by holding their fire until German infantry closed to effective range, then delivering devastating volleys of semi-automatic fire. The Garand allowed small groups of American soldiers to generate firepower equivalent to much larger forces. Companies held off battalions and battalions held off divisions, not through superior tactics or leadership, but through the simple reality that American infantry could fire faster and more accurately than their opponents. Technical Sergeant Jake McNeice, serving with the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, found his unit surrounded near Bastogne. His account, preserved in oral history interviews, describes using his Garand to repel multiple German attacks. He noted that the rifle's reliability proved absolute, functioning flawlessly despite being covered in ice and subjected to continuous firing that heated the barrel until snow melted on contact. He watched German soldiers struggle with frozen bolt-action rifles, their fingers numb with cold fumbling with mechanical actions, while his Garand continued firing as rapidly as he could pull the trigger. The technological advantage, combined with American determination and German exhaustion, turned what should have been a German breakthrough into an Allied victory. By January 25, 1945, when the Bulge was finally eliminated, Allied forces had pushed German forces back to their starting positions. American casualties numbered over 89,000 and German casualties exceeded 100,000. The battle consumed Germany's last strategic reserves and demonstrated that German forces could no longer achieve decisive victories against American and British armies. The Garand, functioning reliably under the most extreme conditions, had helped American infantry survive Germany's final offensive gamble. Soldiers who might have praised their rifles with faint enthusiasm before the Ardennes became fierce advocates, knowing their weapons had kept them alive when everything else had failed. March 7, 1945, and elements of the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, providing Allied forces their first crossing of the Rhine River. The race into Germany had begun, with American, British, and Soviet forces converging on Berlin from three directions. For German soldiers increasingly composed of old men and boys, the sight of American infantry advancing with their semi-automatic rifles represented not just military defeat but the collapse of a world. Volkssturm militiamen, armed with whatever weapons could be scraped together, faced opponents whose basic infantry equipment represented industrial and technological superiority they could not match. The Rhine crossing and subsequent advance into Germany revealed the full extent to which the Garand had transformed American infantry tactics. Unlike the methodical advances of 1944, when Allied forces moved cautiously against prepared German defenses, the 1945 offensive saw American units advancing with speed and aggression that German commanders found difficult to counter. American infantry, confident in their weapons and supported by overwhelming air power and artillery, assaulted German positions with tactics that emphasized firepower and momentum over careful preparation. The Garand enabled aggressive small unit tactics that would have been suicidal with bolt-action rifles. Squads learned to assault bunkers and fortified positions by having riflemen advance while delivering continuous fire, their Garands providing covering fire that kept defenders suppressed while other soldiers maneuvered for close assault. This tactic, known as fire and movement, had existed since the First World War, but the Garand made it dramatically more effective. Single soldiers could provide the volume of fire that previously required entire fire teams. German defensive positions, even when well constructed and properly manned, could not withstand the combination of American firepower and aggressive tactics. A German machine gun position, capable of dominating a battlefield against bolt-action rifles, found itself suppressed by multiple American riflemen whose Garands could match machine gun fire in intensity, if not in sustained volume. This tactical revolution meant German strongpoints could be isolated and reduced quickly, rather than requiring elaborate preparations and supporting attacks. American units advanced at rates that surprised their own commanders, covering in days what previous campaigns had taken weeks to achieve. Private First Class Harold Schreier carried his Garand up Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima, providing security for the Marines who raised the American flag in the photograph that would become iconic. Across the Pacific and in Europe, American soldiers carried their rifles into the final battles of the war. In Okinawa, the last great Pacific battle, Marines used their Garands in the vicious close-quarters fighting that characterized that campaign. In Germany, infantry used their rifles to clear towns and cities in brutal urban combat where split-second firepower meant survival. The final days of the European war saw the Garand in combat against an increasingly desperate enemy. Hitler Youth fighters, old men of the Volkssturm, and die-hard SS units fought with fanaticism that substituted for tactical skill. American infantry, by now veterans of campaigns across 2 continents, applied lessons learned through hard experience. They used their Garands to dominate firefights while minimizing their own casualties, advancing cautiously when resistance was strong and rapidly when opposition weakened. The rifle that had landed in Normandy less than a year earlier now ranged across Germany, carried by soldiers who trusted their weapons absolutely. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, found American soldiers from the English Channel to the Elbe River standing down from combat operations. The Garand had proven itself in every conceivable combat environment, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the rubble of German cities. It had functioned in heat and cold, mud and dust, rain and snow. It had been dropped, submerged, frozen, and subjected to abuse that would have destroyed lesser weapons. Through it all, the rifle, designed by a self-taught immigrant engineer, had kept American soldiers alive and given them victory in the greatest conflict in human history. August 15, 1945, and the Second World War ended with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Garand had served throughout the Pacific War, carried by soldiers and Marines who fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But the rifle story did not end with the war's conclusion. It would continue serving American forces through Korea into the early stages of Vietnam and influence military rifle design for generations to come. The weapon that German infantry had learned to fear became the standard against which all subsequent military rifles would be measured. The M1 Garand's production statistics tell part of its story. Between 1937 and 1957, approximately 6.3 million Garands were manufactured by Springfield Armory, Winchester, Harrington and Richardson, and International Harvester. This represented one of the largest productions of a single rifle model in history, and the rifles that survived military service flooded the civilian market in subsequent decades. Veterans who had carried Garands in combat could purchase their former service weapons through the civilian marksmanship program, and many did so, wanting to own the rifles that had served them so well. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, saw the Garand's final major combat deployment. American soldiers landing at Incheon and fighting in the frozen hills around the Chosin Reservoir carried Garands, facing Chinese and North Korean forces armed with Soviet-supplied weapons. The Garand performed as reliably in Korea as it had in the Second World War, though by now military planners were already developing its replacement. The M14 rifle, adopted in 1957, incorporated lessons learned from the Garand while adding a detachable,